Excellent. Okay, everyone. We are now live on YouTube, and I think we're going to start the event. Thank you so much for coming. I am honestly just so happy to be able to introduce my dear friend Matt today, who's here to talk about his new book, In the Forest of the Blind. I wanted to start with the land acknowledgement, so I'll read that first. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I could say a lot about Matt. I'll just say a few things about his many accomplishments. So Matt King is Associate Professor in Transnational Buddhism at UCR, and he's also the chair of the Asian Studies program at UCR, UC Riverside. Matt did his PhD here in the DSR, and so great to have him back today. Matt's first book is incredible. It's called Ocean of Milk, Ocean of Blood, and it received at least 3 awards. One is the Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion from the American Academy of Religion, which is a big deal, so congratulations again on that. Also, the CESS Book Award in History, and finally, the Specialist Publication Accolade from the International Convention of Asia Scholars. So if you haven't read Matt's first book, it's really amazing. Matt has a long list of articles. I won't name them all today, but please do read Matt's work. He's a very, very gifted writer. I will say a little bit about just personally, I met Matt in 2004. We actually started Tibetan together with Francis Garrett. And so we finished our undergrad at the same time. We were also in the master's program together, and we even overlapped in our doctorates briefly. And so Matt and I go way back, and he's been just such a generous and kind friend to so many people that I know. So it's really just moving for me to be able to introduce Matt today. And I want to say, you know, we're grateful for Matt's friendship and his support, and we're also just so grateful for his scholarship. So today we're going to hear about Matt's new book, which is called In the Forest of the Blind. And this is another one that we have 2 copies of here today. And Matt's going to share with us something about the book. So please join me in welcoming Matt King. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh yeah, thanks. Okay, now let me destroy all that with this insane book and this insane presentation. Thank you so much, Rory. Thank you so much to the host center at the DSR for the chance to be back here and see a bunch of friends, old advisors, not old, but like a long time ago they advised me, advisors who are venerable to me. I'm very excited to kind of continue learning how to talk about this book, since it was a COVID book for me. I've only had a couple opportunities to talk about it publicly. There's an official book launch in theory on Friday for it. There's some stuff at the AR about it, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity to basically try to talk about it clearly today and answer any questions about some of its themes. So let me jump into it. I've got about 35 minutes, I think, and I'll just stop, and hopefully there's some themes or questions that folks are interested in that I can that we can address together. So critiques of Orientalism and reckoning with the colonial legacies of the human sciences are hardly new, of course. Yet to date, surprisingly few studies have tracked the reception of humanist texts and knowledge practices as these were exchanged and remade across Eurasia, into and out of European colonial formations, and into and out of the epistemic sovereignty claimed by the West and its contiguous imperial orders. My book there is an attempt to model doing a kind of circulatory histories in Buddhist studies, work which I think I'm trying to sort of think about as also a non-Western history of the humanities, I think, in ways that I'll try to explain today, working across Qing, Chinese, French, Manchu, Mongolian, and Tibetan frames of reference. And it's an experiment, one that may or may not be successful, to radically expand the picture of our disciplinary past in order to radically imagine our disciplinary futures. So as you'll see, the resources the sources my book considers refuse any pretense to the universal, to sovereign knowledge, nor to indefensible binaries between the sites of scholarship and the sources of knowledge, primary sources. Nor do they bow, or they sort of intentionally try to refuse what Webb Keen calls the moral narratives of modernity, which move in linear progress from the local to the universal, tradition to the modern, from the non-West to the West, from Buddhism to Buddhist studies, for example. The circulatory history I explore in this book involve interconnected 19th and 20th century projects from across Eurasia to make sense of the ancient walking and witnessing of a 5th century monk named Faxian, who I'll introduce in a few minutes. But over the course of research and writing in this book, what became clear is that this was truly a centerless exchange that made and unmade an entire humanist subfield in France, which I'll talk about, but which also made and unmade historical knowledge in the Qing Empire, made and unmade models of world historical order also among Siberians, Mongolians, and Tibetan scholars working in the refugee settlements of 1960s India, for example. So this afternoon, let me share just a little about that big story, hopefully a little clearly, about this dispersed history of field creation. There was also a history of field erasure, about sources spread across the porous boundaries of the humanities and its contiguous knowledge traditions, across which much is always moving. And about what, over the course of writing this book, I came to think of as anti-field history in Asian studies, something that I think really Buddhist studies can explore, a more radical kind of Buddhist studies, which I'll get to at the end. So let's start in the way that my book starts, in the spring of 1830 at the L'Institut de France, the French Institute, where a much anticipated lecture is about to begin. Cue music. Okay, so the savants of Paris whispered excitedly as they took their seats facing the empty podium. The speaker waiting to take the lectern was Jean-Pierre Abel Remusat. Just over 40 years old, he was considered a master of the Orientalist interpretive art. Those who gathered knew him as, quote, the first sinologist in France, even in Europe, in the modern sense of the term, quote. But by 1830, the time of this lecture, in May of 1830, Albert Remusat had distinguished himself for much more than sinology. In the language of fact and event, for decades, he had pioneered scholarly practices to discipline Buddhism, the Buddha, Buddhists, and Buddhist Asia as objects of history, geography, and philosophy. Paris was then the global hub of a new systematic Orientalism, and at the center of its science of Buddhist Asia, as he called it, was Jean-Pierre Remusat, its first professional practitioner. In forums like the Proceedings of the Société Asiatique, or in the pages of the Journal Asiatique, which he founded in 1822, Albert Remusat had for decades mapped Buddhist Asia as a new continent of possibility for Europe. Without any precise physical location, its geography was not of the media of earth or water. Its sovereign territories were inaccessible to imperialists. The Buddhist Asia illuminated by Albert Remusat's scholarship was not any place, any specific place, but an abstracted field of association among places. From its misted over topography, Albert Remusat's disciplinary practices gleaned previously unknown moral and metaphysical resources for the project of becoming modern in Europe. This is how he and those around him understood his scholarship. Controversially, among his critics, Albert Remusat surveyed Buddhist Asia's slopes and spires not exclusively from Indian sources, specifically controversially among the Anglo-Orientalists that were big critics of the Continentals, as they called them. In his field-building scholarship in Paris, Buddhist Asia wound across Central, Inner, and East Asian scripts and dusted texts, many of them previously unknown in Europe. Out of the primitive ether of the non-West, which is not the primitive of the later social evolutionists of the late 19th century, it's sort of other kind of way of thinking about the quote-unquote non-West at the start of the 19th century. Out of the primitive ether of the quote-unquote non-West, that ill-defined and desire-saturated object of Orientalist knowledge, Abache Muset's methods set nations like Cambodia, Tibet, Java, Japan into new analytic relation. Across their differences, they appear now as sharing some deeply historical set of disciplines, ideas, and moral orders. Buddhism on this pioneering scholar's mosaic-like view was spread across Chinese sources as much as it was in Sanskrit. The biography of the Buddha, which Abache Muset and his milieu first presented to Europe, unfurled in Mongolian as much as Pali. While the philosophy of la religion samenen, the Shramanera religion, originated in India, of course, the doctrinal substance of Buddhism, he claimed, could be illuminated only by rigorous comparison of interacting and connected ideas, histories, and literatures from across Asia, much as we continue to think about Buddhist studies and so on in places like the Ho Center, I'd say. Many of those in the lecture hall gathered in 1830 to see Abache Muset lauded him as a genius, a luminary who had established an entire scientific field single-handedly. This is the science of Buddhist Asia. In public writing and oration about him from the 1810s to the 1840s, he was often ranked next to Newton, Pascal, and Leibniz as an individual wellspring for science. But upon closer examination of his published works, his letters, and the impressions of those who knew him, we can reveal his debts. And these are very interesting for the story I'm trying to tell in this book. The objects of history, philosophy, and the first major resource that Abache Muset was drawing together was the old biblically derived philology that had been applied for generations, even centuries, to the languages and literatures of the non-West as it was characterized in Europe. Next, though, and very interestingly, next was the contemporary systematic Orientalism of his patron, the famous Antoine-Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy, who Edward Said writes a lot about in Orientalism, for example. He was Abache Muset's mentor, and so on. It was with Sylvestre de Sacy's mentorship that Abache Muset first undertook self-study of Chinese and Manchu as a young surgeon, a medical student in Paris in the early 19th century. In time, not only could he read Chinese and Tartar, Manchu, Mongolian, and Tibetan, but also he offered Europe some of his first systematic grammars of all these languages. And for this, he was appointed to the Collège de France in 1814 as the world's first research chair in the languages and literatures of China and Tartary Manchu. So this is the first such chair that existed in Europe. However, Abache Muset's disciplining of Buddhist Asia had two other distant and rarely acknowledged sources, which is to say our disciplinary practices and histories today in Buddhist studies has two other distant and rarely acknowledged sources. First was a pre-Darwinian model of racialized and nationalized descent derived explicitly from the great German philosopher and mathematician Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz's project on universal characteristics, which understood all diversity as mirrored and relational, proposed that all differences could be translated into a single grammar. Using, quote, the same procedure, this is how Abache Muset talked about his methodological innovation, the same procedures as Leibniz a century later, Abache Muset and his colleagues thought that they had similarly, quote, recognized the original community of tribes now separated by extraordinary distances in Buddhist Asia, that they had produced a, quote, almost complete genealogical table of the original communities that populated ancient Eurasia and what they called Buddhist Asia. And in explicit reference to Leibniz, Abache Muset and those closest to him invented this notion, this object of a discipline, Buddhist Asia, as a vast continent of similitude, overlaid by only superficial differences. Below Cambodian, below Chinese, below Manchu, below Pali, they imagine in this Leibnizian frame a kind of world of similitude, Buddhism, right? Transhistorical, universal. And they're doing it in an explicit reference to Leibniz. Buddhist Asia's mosaic of scripts, peoples, and ideas masked vast networks of relation, interaction, and mobility that he and those in his closest circle had begun to unlock. The objects of history, philosophy, and geography were to be made by finding and translating mirrored language and concept in idioms for example, in Chinese and Manchu, Mongolian, and Burmese, and so on and so forth. And indeed, some of these, so these, obviously, we can see some of the echoes in what we do today. Now, the other, though, very interesting methodological wellspring for Abel Remusat's Science of Buddhist Asia, and one that bears directly on the story I want to tell, that I tell in my book, and I'll emphasize today, remains mostly hidden in his writing, but I uncovered for this book in archives at the National Library in Paris, which contain all of his handwritten notes and a lot of his letters and so on and so forth. And this was the debt that Abel Remusat's comparative Science of Buddhist Asia owed to reference works produced in the contemporary Qing Empire, contemporary to him, working in the early 19th century. The sovereignty of the Manchu ruling elite, as many of you will know already, and the nature of the Qing imperial formation, though of course always changing, always in flux in thousands of different ways, were founded in fundamental ways in overlapping models of Chinese, Manchu, Mongolian, Tibetan, and Uyghur ethnicity, language, religious history, right to rule, and so on and so forth. And in the 18th century, especially during the reign of Qianlong and Kangxi and so on, many dictionaries, vocabularies, and other translation tools were produced en masse by the court as part of managing the Western territories, as part of projects of statecraft, and so on. These were collected in the 17th century by French envoys and by German ones and by Russians. By the time Abel Remusat takes over this first chair, they populate the libraries in Paris, the national libraries. For example, at the Bibliothèque Royale, as it was called then, where Abel Remusat was appointed as head conservator in 1824. But as I discovered, as early as when he was a student in the 1810s, Abel Remusat poached a comprehensive view of the form, languages, organizing concepts, and equivalencies of what he would soon call Buddhist Asia from Qing encyclopedias and translation guides. So here's the famous Qianlong Pentaglot Dictionary, for example. And here is Abel Remusat's, oh, that's a terrible quality. I'm sorry. In my book, there's better images. I'll have to improve on that. Abel Remusat's handwritten Latin introduction, his handwritten writing of all these equivalencies around Buddha. What is Buddha in Chinese? What is it in, right? He's writing Buddha in Tibetan, right? He's writing Dangye, right? He's writing Burhan in Mongolian, all that stuff, right? So he's literally drawing these equivalencies. He's developing in this Leibnizian frame, in the new Orientalism of this Faxian in the early 19th century, this kind of vision and the methods needed to know it of Buddhist Asia. Okay. And eventually, it was in a Qing literary compendium, also on the shelves of the libraries of the Bibliothèque Royale, that Abel Remusat comes across a previously unknown text in Europe, an account of the wandering of an early 5th century monk named Faxian, to which I'll turn in 1 second. Okay, so for his methodological innovation, as much as the content of his many publications, no less than Hegel was a close reader and associate of Abel Remusat. For example, at the Journal des Savants, for anyone that's into early 19th century kind of intellectual context, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche were also close readers of Abel Remusat in their work and the work of his students. And it was from this circle and from their students and some of the professional environments they created that these three gleaned much of their nihilist vision of Buddhism, that sort of German philosophy of Nichts, of nothingness, right? That becomes so known over the course of the 19th century, and so on and so forth. Okay, I say much about this in the book. And it's for all these reasons that in that May of 1830, the halls at the Institut de France were so full, so expectant, waiting for Abel Remusat to announce this new work. So after welcoming his audience and thanking his host, Abel Remusat announced that his lecture would share preliminary findings about a not yet written book. His topic was a Chinese text as remarkable as it was enigmatic. It was a 5th century travel account written by a monk, a samanen, as he says in French, named Faxian. Faxian was a monk of the Eastern Jin dynasty who had been much disturbed by the incomplete state of the Buddhist canon in China, Abel Remusat announced. Specifically, he had been concerned about the scarcity of available translations of the Vinaya. Without any textual firmament, dedicated monks like Faxian had lived their lives as their disciplined lives with an uncertain connection to the Buddha's long ago example. And so Abel Remusat continued in the year 399, when he was nearly 62 years old. Faxian had departed westward from the city of Chang'an in search of Vinaya. His destination was Tenju, or whatever, what we normally kind of consider India, the wellspring of the Buddhism of the Shramanas. At the close of the 4th century, India was mostly terra incognita for Chinese thought and letters, just as it was among Orientalists gathered in Paris 14 centuries later. Following perilous chains of exchange that connected the Ganges River basin to the lands of the Han, Faxian hoped he could retrieve Vinaya and other scriptures then missing from the Chinese proto-canon. And he did, completing a precarious passage over the course of 14 years, along the way studying Sanskrit and collecting needed records of the Buddhist speech. Upon his return, Faxian wrote an account of his travels, which 14 centuries later, a Manchu imperial court had compiled, and then a French envoy collected, and then this master Orientalist had deciphered, or this is the way he's pronouncing his project. How remarkable. Abel Remusat reminded his audience that no scholar in Europe had ever before guessed that Indian languages and traditions had been known or studied in China, nor among pre-Mohammedan Buddhist societies in what we would now call Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on. Faxian offered an eyewitness account of language and ideas and disciplines of self and community making moving between China and the Mongolian, Tibetan, and Turkic societies ringing the Tarim Basin into Afghanistan and Pakistan, and across the thriving, globalized monastic world of South Asia. The audience held their breath. Upon his return to China, the Frenchman continued, Faxian was entreated by the ruling and monastic elite to write about all that he had seen, and this account became known as the biography of the eminent monk Faxian, or simply the Record of Buddhist Kingdoms. Abel Remusat had determined that the record had circulated widely in many redactions of varying length and focus. There had been Korean and Japanese translations, but not until that spring day of 1830 had any European heard about it or its author's Eurasian Odyssey 14 centuries later. Okay. So this book then becomes the sort of master statement of an evolving science of Buddhist Asia then occurring in Paris. With Faxian's text, the Buddha's biography could now be definitively set into place in time. The spread of his followers could now be charted in trans-Asian constellation. The historical geography of Afghanistan, for example, could be roped to analysis of ethics in Japan, Chinese law to Mahayana philosophy in 5th century Java, Tibetan Lamaist iconography, for he also studied Tibetan Lamaism, as he called it, could be connected to prayers intoned in Ceylon or whatever. So hauling primary text across the epistemic frontiers of the West and non-West, Abel Remusat and those in his young science of Buddhist Asia rendered what they considered the fables of Faxian's record newly into the facts of history. The fluid names and lost monuments that Faxian witnessed as he traveled were made into the objects of geography. And Buddhist moral orders and spheres of intellectual interactions were purified into the language of capital P philosophy in Europe. Okay, to loud applause then, Abel Remusat, promises everyone this book and leaves the stage. Okay, cue light, music, let's change scenes. Okay. And it did, okay? But this is when the story gets interesting. So I just had to preface all this. The book is monumental, right? For a little while. Though not before this luminary of the Orientalist art, Abel Remusat, dies. He dies in the Great Cholera pandemic that besought Paris in 1832 when he was about my age, and it was a bit of a trip reading about all this during COVID and reading about his wife. I found advertisement of his wife selling his book on the streets of Paris, and who knows what happens to her afterwards. Wild stuff. Though 2 years had passed since his lecture that I just, this announcement about this upcoming book, though 2 years had passed, Abel Abel Musset died without yet having published his masterwork of this new science. Two mourning colleagues who are also remarkable and interesting figures in their own right, Julius von Klaproth and Ernest Krefft de Langès, these two, one's a Mongolist, one's a East Asianist, they bring it to print. The result is published 4 years later, and it was titled, as we see, the Relation des Royaumes Bouddhiques. The translation of the Chinese text takes up 50 pages. Their annotations take up 450 pages. This is an staging of a discipline, intentionally so. This is about what counts as authoritative, scholarly, disciplinary knowledge about this object, Buddhist Asia. Who's in, who's out, who are frauds, who are actual scholars, what is the authority? From every noun of the Chinese, and I'm not even exaggerating, every noun, there are encyclopedic essays written by Abel Musset and then his two editors afterwards. So within a decade of, so when it's published, the Relation des Royaumes Bouddhiques, this text is an absolute sensation, but within a decade, Abel Musset's really already being forgotten in many different ways for his field building work. His poached methods from Leibniz and the Qing and all this stuff had been so quickly and universally adopted as that they kind of become invisible. His institution building at the Collège de France and the Asiatic societies and the Journal Asiatique and so on in France are soon forgotten and disregarded. And his pioneering insights and methods were eclipsed by his successors, many of them his students. Eugene Burnouf, who writes the L'Histoire de Bouddhisme Indien, who's usually cited in a lot of our histories of Buddhist studies, is his student. And in fact, in the footnoting of this book, he talks about this up-and-coming Burnouf, who they're going to start writing all these, they're going to start translating Qing pentaglot dictionaries together, right? In the end, the Anglo Orientalists, who are really claiming that Buddhism to be studied scientifically must be studied in Sanskrit and Pali, original Buddhism, sort of the turn to India and the original font to Buddhism kind of rules the day for much of the remainder of the 19th century in ways that kind of help Abel Musset be remembered mostly as a founder of modern and professional sinology, as he's normally. But here's the point. I didn't write my book to correct that record. I could care less about the imperfect memory of normative intellectual history. I do not care. I'm not motivated to offer readers another example of Buddhism made or discovered in the ecologies of colonial Europe, the Orientalist Academy, and so on. While Abel Musset held aloft his interpretation of Faxian's record as the apex of his new science, my book is really interested in exploring the sources and shadows of its pages to see how his science and of Buddhist Asia as a continent of possibility for Europe was unmade in Eurasianist exchange. My book very intentionally rejects this linear vision of field history and looks instead for global histories of field erasure in the humanities. And so to find this story, I needed to follow the play of silence and speech and centralist exchange between Paris and the polylingual courts of the Qing, the nascent Siberian Academy, the Mongolian Buddhist Monastic College, and the Tibetan refugee settlement. And an example of the sort of so here's where all the main players in this circulatory history lived, and here's all the actual places and people that are kind of like that through which this text moves that my book is following. But more than what I can do in this talk, let me just talk about a few of these guys. After Abel Musset, a major node or a major kind of a site for this story comes from the Buryat luminary Dorji Banzarov, a fascinating but very little known figure in the intellectual history of Russia and also in Asian studies, I should say. He writes the first book about something called shamanism, actually, in the mid 19th century. A Siberian loyalist to the Tsar's court, Banzarov was one of the first Asian Russian subjects to be trained in European scholarly practice, including in ethnology and philology. Like Abel Musset in Paris, Banzarov was a disciplinary pioneer. For example, he produced the first ethnology, as I just said, of Siberian shamanism, something we still teach in world religion textbooks, critically, obviously, but he gets the ball rolling in a lot of ways. As part of his SARS-sponsored scholarly trajectory in the 1850s, Banzarov translated Abel Musset's French translation of the Chinese record into Mongolian. Don't know if I have. Yeah, well, anyways, yeah, this is the text, right? This, so like the record of how the Buddhist teaching spread into Mongolian lands. The entire French book is now in classical literary Mongolian, not the footnoting, just the text itself, the actual narrative. This work, which I translate in full in my book as an appendix, brought Faxian's 5th century text and the early 19th century innovations of Abel Remusat into the vast literary republics of Inner Asia, of Mongolian and Tibetan letters. And I think, as far as I can tell, this is the first circuit actually of humanist knowledge in any sustained way into Asia's heartland. Mathematics, science, this stuff's been coming for centuries. But humanism, natural philosophy, specifically around something called Buddhist Asia or Buddhism, this is an early one at least, for sure. Yeah, okay, so, and in this sense, this circuit of humanist knowledge into Asia's heartland was a return, not a new revival. For it was in the Qing polylingual sources of the 18th century, you'll recall, which had given Abel Remusat so much of the frameworks for disciplining Buddhist Asia as an object of natural philosophy in Europe. Much of those Qing polylingual works had been written by Tibetan and Mongolian monks, right? Working across the frontiers from Gunlun, from Kumbum, in Yonhaegung, in Mongolia, working at the courts of Qianlong, Kanchi, to create those polylingual dictionaries. Gungomboja, Tukinchukinima, Sumpa Kempo, all these guys, right? That's what Abel Remusat's reading. That's what he's translating into Latin. And now, through Banzarov's translation to Mongolia, it becomes available to this next generation of Tibetan and Mongolian monks, still in the kind of ecologies of Qing kind of polylingual worlds or whatever. And through the collapse of the Qing also, as we'll see. And another figure who is the protagonist of my first book, I cannot get away from Lobsang Damden Tawadamden. He, Halkha Buddhist abbot from Mongolia, a grand theorist of Qing imperial history and religion, is what I explore in my first book. But it's Lobsang Damden who, in 1917, translates that Mongolian translation of the French, of the Chinese, into Tibetan. And this is the first time Faxian's record is ever in Tibetan letters. Xuanzang's travel narrative comes into Tibetan in the 18th century from Gomboja, right? The guy who wrote the Gyanak Chujung, the history of Buddhism in China, he translated Xuanzang. But Faxian's travel record had never previously been in Tibetan letters until, well, I'm dating it to 1917, but it's thereabouts. We don't know exactly, but okay. In Lobsang Damden's hands, Abel Remusat's humanist work is sort of fully returned to a piece of Inner Asian chronicle, heavily annotated with Qing and Tibetan scholastic references. Any reference to science, to the West, non-West, to the epistemic sovereignty of the humanities or whatever else is utterly absent, of course. It is also heavily annotated in the Tibetan with references to the Kala Chakra, the Abhidharma. Faxian in Mongolian and Tibetan letters basically begins extending entirely other kind of historiographical traditions in 1,000 ways I look at in the book. But here's what I want to talk about is like what happens when we think these things together, and then I'll try to just stop talking. So in thinking all these texts together, all these texts and disciplinary practices and their social sites together, including my own, including your own, I'm trying to experiment with this refusal that comes from attending to what Prasenjit Dwara calls circulatory history. And uncentered is also kind of like a bit of a Deleuze and Guattarian, kind of notion of centralist becoming, right? The rise on all these kind of stuff, right? The uncentered becoming of knowledge that defies the universal and which rejects civilizational narratives and exclusivist forms of epistemic sovereignty, for example, that claimed by European humanism, or which perhaps we also might inadvertently claim in our own work. And this kind of refusal of thinking all of this together comes to be what I started thinking about as anti-field history. This kind of work, as I imagine it, is to illuminate that raw plane of combination, connection, and exchange that makes and unmakes the disciplinary practices of Buddhist and Asian studies. but also of Qing-inflected global historical orders, and the time and place of Mongolian and Tibetan experiences of modernist erasure and exile, and onwards and onwards. There's 1,000 different case studies. I'm just talking about one in this book. Okay, so let me just get to these main questions and I'll try to stop talking. So to that end, my book is really dwelling across all these sources in the footnoting, right? In the interpretive apparatus attached to each of these translations. In the French, the Mongolian, and the Tibetan. They all have their footnotes, right? There's all the little interlinear notes put it between every page of the Tibetan. The French, as I said, is endless. Even the Mongolian, if I have the Mongolian, even the Mongolian, and this is a Buryat Siberian print, has parentheses everywhere, right? And this is just, there were early manuscript versions of the Mongolian, but this is the only one that I have access to. But even that is like heavily annotated in all of these different sites. Drawing deeply from Leibniz and from Qing imperial frames of reference, Qing models of linguistic and historical equivalency, Albert Musset in Paris, his translation and study, is really focused on having Faxian's text solidify in the language of fact and event a bunch of really specific concerns for that moment. Was the Buddha a man who had lived in history? Where did he live? There's all these competing, the prevailing theories of the day were that he was a kinky-haired Ethiopian, right? That he was a Egyptian, that he was an avatar of Mercury and Thor. This is has to do with the primitive ether of that moment, which I get into elsewhere. But so actually making the Buddha into an object of history and of geography. Also, when and where did he live is central. Faxian's text, his translation, allows him to sort of prove incontrovertibly that this is so on. Also, though, in the language of capital P philosophy, Faxian's text allows Albert Musset and his editors to elaborately present Europe with what they called metaphysics, Buddhist metaphysics and ethics. Buddhist metaphysics and ethics, right? So what is parinirvana? What is extinguished? This, Albert Musset and his guys are elaborately kind of explaining this in this work. So this is their project. So there's literally dozens and dozens of examples I look at in the book, but let me quickly move over and tell you about what the Inter-Asian readers and interpreters of Faxian's work, out of the conditions of the French translation, what they're most interested in. Okay, yeah, so they're most interested in things like what of Mongolian and Tibetan community history did Faxian witness? In their interpretations of the work through the choices of the French, they are finding in innumerable ways that Faxian walked through Tibetan mountains, through the Gobi Desert. Faxian came across Bön practitioners in India, right? That the kings, the sort of barbarian kings and Chinese and so on, that in the original text become Mongolian princes, becoming patrons of Faxian, and so on and so forth. There's, again, like entire chapters devoted to how Faxian's record is basically rewritten into, in predictable ways, but interesting ways, I think, into pieces of late Qing kind of models of Qing monastic historiography and so on and so forth. I had a couple of examples, but I don't want to blab on too long. So let me just skip that. And then let me just conclude with the questions that kind of organize the book overall then. So as we've seen, I hope even just briefly in this introduction to the project of this book, Albert Musset and his colleagues mapped Buddhist Asia by transforming models of time, place, and community they read in sources like Faxian's record into the objects of philosophy, geography, and history. And this was long before the invention of comparative religion as a scholarly field, and this was also long before the impact of Darwinian evolutionism on the human sciences, right? Abel Remusat's methods and scholarship carved Buddhist Asia, a new continent of relation and interaction, out of this primitive ether of the non-West. His work on Faxian becomes the masterwork. But speech is always a condition for silence, and writing a condition for erasure. The world historical order of the Qing sources Abel Remusat poached needed to be buried in his French writing, so that the universal frameworks of his Orientalist scholarship could claim the status of a science. But in circulation, out of the political and epistemic sovereignty of the West after his death, the very notion of a science and of the West and of all of its binaries and moral myths of progress and whatever else were muted. So my book kind of experiments in the disciplinary implications of following works like Abel Remusat's study and translation as it moved across the perilous frontier of the humanities and its contiguous adjoining knowledge traditions like Qing scholarship, like the Buddhist monastic college in Inner Asia. These are porous frontiers between the French Academy and the monastic courtyard on Mongolia, or the Qing court of Qianlong, and the Robert Ho Center at the University of Toronto today. The disciplinary apparatus of a science, or of the Qing court scholars, or of the Buddhist monastics were dismantled so that others could be assembled. As Claude Lévi-Strauss once put it, quote, "The progress of knowledge and the creation of new sciences take place through the generation of anti-histories, which show that a certain order which is possible on one plane ceases to be so on another," end quote. So in the case of my book, history, geography, and philosophy made out of Qing reference work through these Leibnizian frames of racialized hierarchy and similitude circulated back into Qing frames of reference of world historical order. The masterwork that founded the science of Buddhist Asia became a condition for Chichum, for Tuk in Mongolian, right? For Namtar, for Lungten, for all these sorts of things. Buddhist Asia was scrubbed away and Jambudvipa arises again, right? In circulation into Asia's heartland, there would be a reversal of Michel Foucault's famous phrasing. The past would be made anew from history. And of course, I am now part of that, having written this book, and you are as well for having listened to it. So let's think about this together. And I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Well, yeah, I don't want to talk. I could go on so long. So
no, that's okay. So I think in terms of questions, we'll just need to pass the mic around.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll take it now. Actually, we'll just need people who are attending on the live stream to kind of hear us.
Yeah.
I'll actually start with the group. Does anyone have a question to start off with? If not, oh yeah, okay, sure.
Thank you. So here's the, is there?
You can just talk here.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful talk. And I mean, just so kind of broad and thorough. And to me, it was just so fascinating how, as you said, these ideas were scrubbed from Buddhist Asia, then, you know, part of the political economy in the continent, and then brought back into Buddhist Asia, brought anew, right? I mean, there's so many questions and there's so many places where one could kind of start with, but I guess the first thing I'd like to know is, how did Abel Remusat do the scrubbing from his sources? And so this is like me not having actually looked at your book, and I'm sure you actually, and I'm particularly interested in like the methodologies that he's finding. Did he comment on how these encyclopedic kind of histories were written? And how does his new method or his new scientific approach differ from the sources that he's taking them from? So, because I think it's not only, I mean, I love this idea of the erasure of the fields, right? And I think we could almost all in this room like relate to how we've either been a part of that, or we've seen it happen, or much of what we've learned has been done on the back of that kind of erasure. But I'm particularly interested in how we argue about this methodology is inferior somehow and our methodology is superior, because oftentimes we when we look at some of these sources, you know, if I look at like Burmese monastic materials, right, I don't even see a methodology because I'm not trained to understand it, or I somehow think it's not as good as the methodology that I'm kind of imbibing. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how he's doing the scrubbing, and if he comments on, because obviously these sources were valuable for him, but somehow he has to justify his kind of erasure of it, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thank you. Well, yeah. So he's you don't need to read far. I mean, I tried to read everything that I could of Avidly Mousset's for the purposes of this book. And he's very intentionally discipline building, right? I mean, this is his project. And he is doing so in, of course, like deep, sustained, critical encounters with or engagement with natural philosophy, with previous scholars claiming the status of sinologists, who like Froment and these others who he tries consistently to show were absolute frauds, as they were in many cases. But also like in talking about Rousseau, about Leibniz, right? I mean, he's talking with Hegel about this stuff. He never leaves Paris. He never, it was the Anglo, scholars, right, who were really like in Nepal and elsewhere, of course, in the colonial context, right? I mean, Avidly Mousset himself never left Paris. But you have to read very deeply to start seeing the Qing intellectual tradition as he knew it, as it existed from the 17th century on the shelves of the Bibliothèque Nationale in the early 19th century, shine through. His job was not in the languages and literatures of China. It was in the languages and literatures of China and Tartary Manchu. Okay, so he's celebrated. You can pick up go to Robarts and pick up histories of sinology. He'll be in there. His essay sur les langues et littérature de les Chinois, or whatever, sorry for my terrible pronunciation, his famous essay proving that China has grammar. That matters because that means that China has systematic systems of thought, right? And this makes him famous. It's been a long-standing debate, right? He also produces those grammars for Manchu, for Mongolian, for Tibetan, for Uyghur, right? And those in his immediate circle, like Klaproth and others, right? They're discipline building, to a T. So they're and also they're. So the methodology, it's all about method. That's actually my point. I try to really talk about this in the book. And this is why we need to think about this now in a lot of ways. It's like text critical scholarship, comparative scholarship, the idea, and even these notions of similitude under difference. I mean, like it's here, you know what I mean? We're all trained in it, you know what I mean? So I'm just saying like, this sort of in the claiming the status of a science, inventing an object like Buddhist Asia as an object for capital G geography, capital P philosophy, capital H history is his project. And he's widely, he's famous for it. You read the obituaries for Avidly Mousset, they're in the courts of the Tsars and they're in America. You know what I mean? They're everywhere. It's remarkable. But the Qing kind of, Qing models of as Prashanth Dwar calls it, like the language game of the Qing, this sort of like staging of sovereignty through knowledge traditions that were meant to show kind of equivalency and standardization and centralization. All these great encyclopedias and pentaglot dictionaries and reference works and institutes to train administrators and translators and all this stuff in the 18th century. I mean, that's in the background of the disciplining of Buddhist Asia and Europe explicitly. And as I said, I went into the archives and you find texts like this, which are remarkable. I want to write an article about it. This is like a 40-page document. He's literally reading these things. This is in 1810. This is like the predominant theory is that the Buddha was a quote-unquote kinky-haired Ethiopian, right? Or that he was this avatar of Mercury that was found in the fables of Eurasia. Europe already knew, he was placeless, right? It wasn't even, he's literally drawing lines. He's hand copying as he's being drafted as a surgeon in Napoleonic Wars during the day and training as training med school. He's at night doing this, just as he's teaching himself Chinese through Manchu reference works. This is how he does this. So you can see it. It's literally his handwriting, and he later writes about this and reflects on it. So, his interlocutors are Hegel. They're not, Tibetan Mongolian monks. But Tibetan Mongolian monks wrote this stuff in the context, you know what I mean, in the context of the Qing Imperial project of the 18th century. And as Abdelkhaim Musset continues in his work, this is not even controversial. He continues long-standing correspondences with Jesuits and Capuchins and others at the courts of the Qing. His friends in Russia, Schmidt and all these guys, you know, they continue sending him Qing works. Like the entire project of disciplining, this kind of disciplinary project is in constant enduring connection with the Qing. And just what's very interesting is that in this particular story of circulation is that the masterwork of this project, his translation and study of Faxian's Fuguoji, like ends up back in the hands of guys, those Tibetans and Mongolians, who themselves are trying to make sense of the collapse of the Qing, of the rise of state of socialism, of nationalist erasure. Oh, I didn't say, I cut out of this version, but the first Chujung, the first history of the Dharma, written in the Tibetan monastic settlements by, as far as I can tell, is by a scholar named Ngawan Nima. It's written in 1964 or so. The Chujung Lungrik Dunme, the Lamp of Scripture and Reason, right? That text, this is the first monastic history written by Tibetans after they've been run out of the mountains and are in these tuberculosis-stricken, dire Tibetan settlements, especially in the early 1960s, gives the deep history that's sort of contextualizing this trauma, the loss of territory, community, and all the rest. A crisis, a rupture in history and time, power, not by reference to the Sempo of the Yarlung Empire, not by reference to Genghis Khan, not by reference to the Manchukuo Manchu emperors. Faxian. Faxian's walking is at the start of that work, because by then, this was already in Faxian's, through the circulation, Faxian's text has already come to tell these stories, you know what I mean, through this broad circulation. So, I mean, yeah, so anyway, so it's like this impact is there. But what's so interesting is if you pay attention from like a social history of knowledge perspective, precisely paying attention to interpretive practices, then this stuff happens. It's on the level of method, actually, that everything happens, that these kind of stories like emerge. And I think that's why they have something to tell us about diversifying our own, perhaps, disciplinary methods. What happens if we think it all together in the way like Bernard Cohen says we ought to think about the colonial metropole and the frontier as a single field of inquiry, right? There's a single plane of inquiry very quickly that emerges that completely reject differences between primary and secondary sources, certainly the West, non-West, local, all this stuff, you know what I mean? And it absolutely refuses the West as site and source of universal history and knowledge. And that's really the point. So in other words, like thinking at the level of method and circulation, I think we actually can start doing what is called elsewhere de-orientalizing, even decolonial work, instead of just naming the legacies in our scholarship. Yes, obviously. Well, what do we do? So I think that there's projects here for a more expanded, diversified, centralist kind of disciplinary history, one that is outside of the model of influence and impact of the West, just continually impact and influencing the non-West, that we ought to pay attention to. And I'm just trying to do that. In the case of this one text, there surely are hundreds of other texts and similar sites and interactions that people who are specialists in other areas could find.
I have a question. So you mentioned, I think I heard you correctly, that when when the French translation was then translated into Mongolian, that the notes, the annotations were not translated along with the narrative. Is that right?
They were not included in translation, but it is obvious that the translator had access to them because he makes a lot of wild choices when he needs to translate them. It comes out of having read the footnotes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So my question to you is, what do you think the decision to not include in their complete form the annotations? First of all, what does it tell us about the Mongolian translator? Sorry, I'm forgetting his name. Yeah, and yeah, Manzarov. And then how do you think it impacts the reception of the work? Yeah.
Thank you. So, okay, so yeah, it's in the book, but Banzarov's work is part of a series of translations he's doing of, European scholarship, like state of the field works for Mongolian art. This is part of like a proto-Buryat intelligentsia movement that later on basically become architects for the Asian sides of the Soviet Union, the Mongolian People's Republic, and elsewhere. He's very early on, but one of these guys. So he's translating all kinds of things into Mongolian, right? Now he dies young, and things get lost. But what is clear is that there were manuscript copies of Banzarov's Mongolian translation of Faxian's record, this text, that circulate handwritten copies for 70 years. The one that the Tibetan translator, the translator Tibetan, that's actually an inner Mongolian handwritten copy. That's like very far away, right? And it's actually like I found sources that kind of talk about how they were literally going around in the context of early revolutionary Mongolia, collecting manuscript copies from like old grannies in yurts up by Irkutsk and, you know, I was like Khalkhan down by Inner Mongolia. And then they print, this guy Rinchen prints this version. And so the Tibetan translator, you know, he's got one of these manuscript versions, but it aligns pretty closely to the printed one, which is the only one I've ever had access to. There might be some in like the Russian Academy, you know, Orientalist Academy, but it's kind of hard. It's hard to go there, as you know, especially right now. Now, so that's to say that the apparatus of footnoting, which itself, of course, has an interesting history and there's lots of studies on it, are less important. But Banzarov has access to it because he takes haphazard guesses and sort of arguments that are elaborated in the footnoting, and they just show up as the actual words he's using in the translation, which in many cases are like wild kind of transitions from the original text or right turns. Like for example, I mean, like we're reading here in the text that like Faxian's encountering like shamans and Mongol kings and all that stuff, which is coming out of footnoting from the Parisian scene earlier. And the Tibetan source, of course, like as we all know who are working in this stuff, like this kind of thing is normal, right? Like, I mean, the idea of annotation and interlinear notes. This text is also supplemented with readings of Xuanzang's text as well, and passages from the Langrulung Tempa, Liulung Tempa, all these like famous canonical works, of course, the Abhidharma, the Kala Chakra. And interestingly, guys that this guy knew who had walked to India in the 19th century and had seen some of the places, right? So this is very common for frontier Qing historiography among Tibetans and Mongols that I'm interested in, this sort of like broad synthetic work, working across multiple linguistic frames, which of course is one of those products, some of those products Abel Musset was reading in Paris, which is founding disciplines. But then it goes back and is read by these guys. Yeah, sure. Any other? Oh.
No, please.
So I love your work, Matt, and it's mostly exciting because you bring in sort of critical scholarship and ideas like knowledge production to a stodgy old field like Buddhist studies. So again, it's very exciting to read this stuff. I've just come back from a 4-day intense conference on the state of Buddhist studies and philology, where we were sitting around with a bunch of people who work on manuscript traditions. And I work on Dunhuang manuscript traditions, Chinese and Tibetan stuff from the 9th and the 10th centuries. This looks very similar to all the material that I can date to before the year 980. We have multilingual glossaries, handbooks, annotated translations, this whole thing. So I'm wondering in this project to decenter, so this is just, I do the text critical work that you're talking about, the foundations of. So I'm wondering what kind of insights from your research into this topic, where does this fit in with the kind of boring, lame philological stuff, the text critical stuff, the source critical stuff that some of us are still doing? And how original is all this to this 18th, 19th, 20th century stuff that you've been documenting for the past decade? I mean, a lot of this Dunhuang material looks very modern in certain respects, right? So how new is this? And like what insights can we use from your work and your research into these like enclaves of documenting the Eurasian Odyssey, as you say, which is a very nice way to put it. back onto our text critical work today. I won't dare say that our text critical work is not relevant, but how does this all work together now? If this is the field moving forward, what are we looking at now in terms of the broad sort of specs of the work that people who identify as Buddhist studies scholars do?
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, I hope that I think the short answer is that nothing's original here actually at all. What is original is just because of the time period is that the humanities, European natural philosophy is in the mix. In a long, old story, one that of course you know better than I do, of Eurasian exchange, erasure, silencing speech, synthesis, and all the rest. Yeah, so I think that the focus of this book is to basically introduce our field histories into that, what is always a sort of meshing of exchange, that where knowledge production is also knowledge erasure, whether we're talking about Qing projects or natural philosophy, right? And I think that the luxury of thinking this way in the context of in ways that include the disciplinary histories of, say, Buddhist studies or Asian studies or something, is that it also sort of allows us to maybe decenter, to denaturalize, to historicize a little bit about the sort of presumptions that we ourselves might be, in ways that are often pointed out. But beyond that, I think also perhaps enact in our own disciplinary practices a kind of a more diversified way of thinking about fundamental building block things like agency, like the linearity or whatever of time, about what we're reproducing inadvertently. So that's kind of the focus of this book. I do think, however, though, that in terms of what was happening in the 9th century, I mean, you guys are doing the work, right? What's happening at Dunhuang versus what's happening in China, what's happening elsewhere in Central Tibet. I mean, you guys are doing all this work of reading and comparing all this stuff together to understand what is being made, how is Dunhuang of center versus the, all these things. That is not my world, and I don't want to trespass too much. But I think that, yeah, I think that, to be honest, I think that if there's anything interesting in this book, it has to do with reimagining, or not reimagining, but thinking critically about disciplinary practice in Buddhist studies and Asian studies through doing a more like global diversified way, kind of sense of field history in a way that actually denies the linearity of field history entirely. And I hope maybe opens up some critical resources for how we teach and think about kind of multiple sites and categories alongside one another. In ways that don't just reify one. I mean, obviously that's like 101 for people actually working in complex polylingual sites, like polycultural sites like Dunhuang. I just think that we should talk about our disciplinary histories and also from that lens, as scholars of Buddhist studies with all this specific technical language and historical training, let's contribute more like global histories of the humanities. I mean, that's kind of the basic bit here. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think there's anything radical new, other than that all of us in Buddhist studies should read what people who do histories of disciplinary knowledge and social history knowledge are actually doing, and then we'll have a much wider audience for what we're up to. I think you do. I'm sorry. There's some.
For the sake of the other one. So my question, well, sorry for arriving late, and I want to congratulate you on your publishing your new book. And so I kind of have a rough idea of what the book is about, because Professor Rory has explained to us in class. And so basically is Faxian's record and how the text kind of throughout history have gone to many different countries, and how cultural different culture have their own translation of it, and how the culture has influenced the world, right, basically. So my view is that for example, nowadays, for us to take the ancient wisdom of Buddhism, do you think that is important to consider specific regional and historical origin of these knowledge, or is it better if we extract the essence of the teaching and to see what is practical for our day-to-day implementation? For example, like the text Lemrin, it's the stages of the path, is basically extracted the essence out of the Dharma teaching into like a stages of the complete path that leads to enlightenment, including some basic understandings such as the preciousness of human life, death, and danger of lower rebirth, and the Four Noble Truths, and our ability to cultivate compassion, so Mahayana Buddhism, love, and for compassion for all living beings. And I think this is like common grounds that like despite whether Buddhist or non-Buddhist, we need to have this view of what life is like and what the world is like, what how our human own life, everyone matters. It's not exclusive to Buddhism. So do you think we can extract a system of knowledge like this, a pure knowledge, or do you think it's very important that we consider the distinct cultural roots of where it's from? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Are you in the Tibetan class? I love that there's a question that involved Lam Rim. That's great. Well, let me say this. The distinction you're drawing is not one that was familiar to Lobsang Damden himself, who was a prolific author of Lam Rim, but who also was concerned fundamentally with ordering, Kopa, clarifying, Sawa, right? The conditions in which his community was funded, how power structures worked, how the regional Mongolian administrative banner in which he worked was woven into trans-Eurasian administrative frames in the Qing, and then in the, you know, the early socialist programs of the revolutionary movements in Mongolia, as were his students who then escaped to Lhasa and were forced to write the same, to deal with the same questions from the great Gelug monasteries of Lhasa. Well, the Soviet Union happens, and the Siberians come down to Mongolia in 1917, and they start shooting everyone in Halkha in 1937, and then they go to Lhasa, and then the Chinese, the PLA arrive in 1959. So Ngawan Nima, who I'm not sure if you're here for this, who writes the first Chizhong, the first monastic history in the Tibetan refugee settlements, he's not Tibetan, he's not Mongolian, he's Buryat. He experienced 3 revolutions, 3 waves of Gelug monasteries in which the Lam Rim is propagated most prominently. No, Ngawan Nima, who was sent to Hakka, Mongolia as a gifted student by Agvan Dorjiev. Do you say Agvan Dorjiev? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, sorry. No, different guy. Yeah, different guy. Sorry. Agvan Dorjiev was another Buryak guy who's involved. Sorry, I got nerdily excited there. Anyways, so my point is this, right? What is the essence of Buddhism is always historical. There is no essence of Buddhism, or at least there are so many essences as to be anyways, you know, so those questions of like what the authors of Lam Rim are saying based on the work of Atisha and all the rest. I mean, of course, these are historically specific and important. But for the scholars with whom we're studying and whose sources must force us to bite back, as Michel de Soto would say, rebondant, was force us to think about better questions when we encounter them. And here we're in the Department for the Study of Religion. I do believe it's important to think about death and impermanence and the preciousness of human life. I also think it's important to allow the voices of scholars from these areas to tell us, for us to revise and radically confront the way that we do history, that we do geography, that we do philosophy, and that we organize a kind of an institute like the Robert O Foundation. So to answer your question, I think it's yes to both. Yeah.
So with respect to your answer, I have a follow-up. So besides looking at the pure lineage of the pure Buddha doctrine, we need to consider the historical aspects as well, how these guys have, well, these precious lamas have inspired us to reflect also on the historical roots of the practice. So now I have a question that I also discussed with Professor Rory in class. So we're going to ask you today. I'm going to ask you today, which is so it's like with regards to the controversial practice of the Dhammapala Dorje Shugden, which is widely seen in both Mongolia, Tibet, and China, and have recently been very controversial. So, yeah, that's my question. What is your take on this issue and how that inspires us to reflect on the history of Dharma practice?
Thank you. Yes. I don't know if there's enough time to really bring everyone else into the Dorje Shugden Schism and its 400-year history. I will be talking about this at the AAR this year, though, if anyone wants to come and yell at me or protest. But here's the question. Zawa Damden, conveniently enough, is on the screen here. He wrote the Dorje Shugden Bebum in Khalkha, Mongolia in the early 20th century, not Pabanka Rinpoche. The Dorje Shugden Schism has produced wildly unfortunate violence in the Tibetan refugee communities, in Tibet, in the PRC, in Mongolia, in communities within a few square blocks of here for a long time. And I'm certainly not weighing in on that violence. But it's helpful to understand that violence by doing history, actually. What was Dorje Shugden? How did that tradition spread? How is it connected with the essentially colonization of Kham, Amdo, Inner Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, Manchuria, Siberia, North China by the Gelug tradition beginning in the 17th century? Dorje Shugden travels as Datsang. Monastic colleges are colonized and kind of been put in place as Gelug monasticism moves across Inner Asia into East Asia. And there's entire histories there that set Buddhism and forms of Buddhist government and forms of Buddhist community power and authority into the plural. And we don't find that plurality by simply reading a single one of these kinds of texts, or if we follow too closely the self-narration of Buddhist lineages. But if we can read sources against each other, as scholars like Zawa Damden did, as Albert Musset, the French scholar, did, as we try to do when we're doing history, then a beautiful sort of like plurality of histories and traditions emerge. And happily, the world is more complicated. No, Bebum, like a ritual collection. Yeah. That's later compiled by Pabanka Rinpoche and Tujung Rinpoche. And he collects the Topik, the collected teachings heard of Daya Pandita, a famous disciple of the fifth Dalai Lama, Khalkha disciple of the fifth Dalai Lama, who was also a student of Tulku Dapa Gyaltsen, who's, I'm sure you already know, is considered by Shugdenpas to be the murdered rival of the fifth Dalai Lama who becomes Shugden. And Zawa Damden finds that Topik and the lost biography and collected works of Tulku Dapa Gyaltsen, which had been banned in central Tibet by the fifth Dalai Lama, in a hole in a monastery in Khalkha in the 19 teens. So why is that there? Isn't Shugden supposed to be a Pabanka, a fundamentalist movement of Pabanka in central Tibet? The story is more complicated. So we can use tools from all these ways while still being eminently respectful to the types of violence and exclusion that attend this, and not be callous about just how real it is for many people, both in the refugee community and in Tibet and in Mongolia today. So we should be careful and sensitive, but also history provides a lot of useful ways of making the story more complicated, which is what it always is. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt, for a very interesting talk. I'm kind of interested, you talk about here about this work by Faxian providing new historical resources to these scholars in Inner Asia, developing an Asian historiography independently of Western influence. So kind of two questions. One, can you sort of describe what these Asian historians, how are they using this source? Like, how are they changing it? Or you kind of nodded to this during your talk. So what were their strategies, or what were they changing, and why, if you can sort of hazard a guess? And then, because there was Asian historiography, Tibetan historiography before this. So were they doing something that was new, or is it just simply the fact that they were using this source that came from somewhere new, basically?
Maybe I'll just say that's kind of book publisher language. I think that's in the back of the book. So the way I kind of explored in the book, which is actually precisely the way that you say it, which is like, well, here, I'm trying to make the case in the book that, you know, a more diversified and critical history of the humanities outside of sort of Europe and European tradition, which includes European colonies in which there was a relation of force between metropole and frontier, that does not pertain in the situations here, right? I'm not talking about Sri Lanka, I'm not talking about Thailand, I'm not talking about Myanmar, I'm not talking about Nepal, we're talking about Mongolia, Tibetan communities in the Qing courts, right? So we're not talking about the usual way these kinds of circulations are explored in the first place, right? So in thinking about, I mean, it's precisely as you say, I mean, the humanities, the point is that the humanities are basically like gleaned from and poached from and made out of and all of these sort of like, through these disciplinary practices, out of contiguous traditions, out of indigenous traditions, out of field sites, out of archive. I mean, this is the sort of interpretive work of the, what Michel de Certeau calls the heterologies, right? The absent dead are entombed as facts and events in history and all the rest. I mean, this is this site. But the point is that they're in circulation into these other sites of longstanding existing interpretive sites and historiographical traditions, ways of synthesizing history. In the case of this book, very specific to the sort of polylingual worlds of the Qing, in which these, even these Mongolian and Tibetan authors I'm exploring were very closely involved with. That, yeah, like the humanities is just basically gutted. Its skeleton is, you know, all pretensions to the imperializing frames and ideologies of a science are simply absent. Of course, they mean nothing, right? So the point is just that, like, and so the insights of venerable French sinologists or Mongolists or whatever are quickly reassimilated and made into extending prophetic traditions from, you know, Khotan or whatever that these guys are reading. Just as Qing reference works in some of their own histories, like Sagan Sechen's history is a big one in the background here, were made into avidly science, inventing this notion of Buddhist Asia. It's nothing, it's not that interesting even, it's just obvious. But what happens if we're thinking about all these together? That's kind of the point, right? What happens if we include in the history of the humanities the ways that the humanities were unmade, and really think deeply also about, of course, the sites and sources and knowledge traditions that were sort of appropriated or reused, repurposed in the sort of founding moments of these different fields. That's the only point of this book. There's thousands of these examples. And in fact, they've been widely studied elsewhere, like in Latin America and indigenous communities in North America, just not so often in I don't want to use the word anymore, Buddhist Asia, not so much, especially outside of colonial contexts in Asia. But thanks for the question.
Okay, I still want to know. To what extent can we use the insights from your study to think about pre-modern Buddhist Asia?
Yeah, sure. The insights from my study are only that in thinking about excellent scholarship on disciplinary knowledge applies and pertains to non-European derived academic traditions in ways I think are widely illuminating for the study of pre-modern Buddhist Asia. So in other words, how communities of experts were constructed and others were exiled, how particular institutions and social practices, yeah, sorry.
Right. So let's say we take Buddhist scholasticism of the 10th century, for which we have a ton of documentation in the form of manuscript witnesses to this kind of exegetical enterprise. So I can only use the methods, I can't, maybe not only, but I use the methods derived from these 19th century Western workshops in the form of philological inquiry and the science of text critical work. I mean, biblical hermeneutic. I mean, it's, it had big implications for a number of fields of study. So I'm just wondering, like, to what extent, like if I want to take up your call to do this kind of reflexive work and thinking about the, undoing the discipline, what happens to philology? Or like, what are my methods then? So methodology is also something that I'm incredibly interested in and teaching here now. So where does this leave us? I mean, I'm kind of just messing around with you, but like, playing the devil's advocate.
That's why I'm so lucky to have worked with you. Because you're right. I mean, but I guess this is the thing, right? I think that the answer really lies in a lot, like, as I said, and as you're saying, like in the area of methods in the first place. But I'm thinking a lot in this book with Wael Halak's book, Restating Orientalism, and which is really calling out the failures of decolonial scholarship, de-Orientalism, and de-imperializing scholarship to actually do anything different, ever, right? Now, and his point is that if you want to critique whether a non-Middle Eastern person can talk about Islam or all that kind of stuff, you need to also take on the epistemic commitments of chemistry and of pharmacy, right? If you are not, this is the height of intellectual incoherence. And his point is that there's a fundamental sort of like commitment to what he glosses as this epistemic sovereignty of the West. The West is site and source of universal history, things that have been widely noticed. But it's really at that fundamental level about our expectations of how time moves, about how knowledge about it ought to move, and so on and so forth, that inevitably at a fundamental level sort of reproduces a sort of like local, universal, small tradition science, West, non-West kind of move. I mean, it's really hard to get outside of that. And so one move to begin, I think, daring to imagine what the doing of outside of that would be, and not just naming its legacies, is to think about like how we can juggle multiple, say, models of history at once. Like, what does it really mean to, what might it mean to write a scholarly study of Dunhuang manuscripts that operate with a particular model of historical time that are found in the sources? I don't know. What happens if we use the philological methods that are well documented of a particular scribe or interpreter or ritualist from Dunhuang to write an article for JAS or for JAR? I'm just saying, like, I don't know. I just think like I think it's time to stop pointing to genealogies and naming legacies and start daring to do actual scholarship that is different. All right. And so in these materials I'm looking at in this book, just one example, are sort of suggesting circulation, the sort of like upturning of arbor-like field history, linear field history, into this mash of leaves and exchange, and thinking about what comes out of that. I think all of our sources may perhaps demand methodological imagining that are specific, and specificity is good. And we should be, and I think the major thing is we implicate ourselves, actually, and we refuse, or at least seriously question, even the notion of the difference between primary and secondary sources, objects and subjects of scholarship. That itself, of course, is an Orientalist conceit, and it's just not real, actually, right? There is profound exchanges, dialectics, and implications for these. We're writing in counter narratives, and I think the more we write ourselves into it and we leave things open-ended, the whole project of Aberhe Moussad and guys, and probably a lot of other scholarship that gets presented in this room, starts to be decentered in interesting ways. I don't know, but that's what I'm thinking might happen. Can I sort of chime in? Yeah, and then we'll go to Chinmay. I feel like first the answer is on.
Hey, Michael, just one second. Just for the
Because I feel like part of the answer might be on the screen too, because it might not be relevant to Dunhuang, but Tibetans had their own kind of text historical methods. They talked about like which sources are more reliable, or.
Oh, I'm not saying that I don't know that. I'm saying that's all I know. When you read the manuscript, the travelogue is loud, right? And if you actually take your source material seriously, that's exactly what you speak, right? So then when you're trying, like there's a natural way of thinking of the sources. that is not dependent upon, 19th century Frenchmen, right? Of course. So anytime you're engaging, my point is, let's just start reading Buddhist texts again and material culture, right? So this like meta conversation about what we're doing, it's like, yeah. It's super exciting. Yeah, no.
You know what I'm saying? Because like, we can read. I agree. What happens if we write that way? I mean, Catherine Shin has this beautiful essay called Radiant Historiography, which centers as the project of historiography the wild, radical, precarious space of encounter with pre-modern texts. Yeah. And so she's saying, she has another interesting idea, which I talk about in this book. I forgot to say that, which is theory is theory, but never have we considered how the writing of our scholarship itself models and extends theory. So even the writing of, right? Like, what happens if our texts look like that? Like, what if we, like, where are the frayed edges? You know what I'm saying? Like, what if we, like, and there's incredible examples from all kinds of incredible, like, other sisterly, neighborly traditions, right? I look at Black studies scholarship at my own campus, and I think about how radical it is, the performance of scholarship, the radical, like, rawness and honesty of some of this excellent history is amazing, kind of both methodological and also like literary references for us. So maybe that's the question, like, how can the writing of our scholarship extend in more direct and ways full of possibility from our reading? Maybe that's a great way to think about it. I mean,
yeah, I got a very similar question, which is raised by Professor Amanda. You begin with maybe criticizing the Orientalist act, where 19th century European scholars such as Brian Adam and Max Muller, who were largely, influenced by this Orientalist kind of scholarship, who really were into the textual narratives and talking about, whole lot of translation from all these in so-called traditional source of Sanskrit, Tibetan, and other languages. And then today we have different method and which criticize all this kind of Orientalist approach, and now we have different way of looking into Buddhism. For example, anthropology is one of the way of talking about. But now my question is that, are we really missing link with so-called traditional Buddhism by adapting different, way of method, different way of studying? Because what I see is, like, maybe in this process of adapting different method, we are really traditionalizing the whole religion. What I'm trying to say is that really we are missing link from so-called historical Buddhism or historical Buddha, or what we are studying today. So what do you think about that?
sorry, so you're saying that we're missing that link, or we ought to?
Yeah, really. That's because I'm more like philological kind of, not only translation, but missing link between what tradition and then what we understand today. Lived experience, maybe you could call it.
Well, there is such a thing as lived tradition. There is such a thing as the master narratives of master texts. There is such a thing of those who had the privilege to write about their lives and those who did not. There are the genre expectations and power-laden contexts in which those who could write about their lives did so. None of which is transparent or open to us in an immediate way. There are those who are in the traditions, who understand themselves today to be in a lineage of those traditions that also live their lives in important ways, framed by them. I mean, to me, I don't see any contradiction in thinking about how our sources can provoke critical reflections that help diversify and reimagine perhaps what we're doing in the critical Asian humanities, And I really do believe that Buddhist studies actually could be leading and not simply following theoretical innovations being made elsewhere in critical Asian humanities. I also think that we ought to have answers, especially nowadays, even if we're all wanting to be good old-fashioned philologists for provocative questions, such as Chen's and Asia's methodology. Why is Asia always the object, not the generative condition for method and theory? You know, why are we thinking about 19th century, Amdo or something, with all those scholars who only have last names and no place, Foucault, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, or whatever? What happens if we reverse that? I mean, many people are exploring this in all kinds of adjacent fields. This isn't new. But what happens actually when we do that? What happens if we move and actually try to organize our scholarship or our teaching, more fundamentally than that, the kind of like epistemic categories, the models of history that we are reproducing in our scholarship and in our classrooms in those ways, right? I mean, there's a place for all of this, but I also think a place is for Buddhist studies, and a kind of critical Buddhist studies is to like theorize, right? How our social lives lived, what are boundaries between the person and environment, right? What is a mind? What is a subject? What is personhood? Where does it stop and end? I mean, why are we, we're working in continental European, basically literary theory frames and a whole long history of social science and humanities theory. But we can also imagine elsewhere, as people are doing in the Indigenous Studies department down the road, right? I don't know if there's an ethnic studies department here, but as many people on this campus and in this department are doing, I'm just saying, philologists don't get a free pass. Like you're either aware of what you're doing or you're not. You're still doing it. You have to work with some model of history. You have to still make choices about what you're reading. You have to still communicate that to those who have not read the sources, who don't know how to read in the way you do. So you can acknowledge it or not, but you're reproducing something. So you might as well get radical about it, or at least become aware of it. You know what I'm saying? And then like demand leading the charge a little bit. That's my opinion, at least. I mean, that's my interest. I am aware that it's after 6:30 by quite a bit, and people need to get home, like my mom. So. Thank you.
Thanks everyone who was joining online.